We will be speaking in English, so if that's a problem for people, I should say it up front. We have, over the past year, had the privilege of having among us as a fellow here at the Wilson Center Carlos de la Torre from Flaxo, Ecuador. And he and Steve Striffler are the editors of the Ecuador Reader, which is available for sale on the table outside. So this sometimes is an event that we would commemorate with a book launch, but we're really trying to do two things. And among our principal objectives as the Latin American program is to have a substantive discussion about current Ecuadorian politics. Ecuador just celebrated presidential elections. Rafael Correa was reelected, and we have also with us Catherine Conahan, who has done extensive field work in Ecuador and has done a lot of writing, particularly about Correa's last presidential campaign. So we have really a lineup de lujo, as they say in Spanish, just a stellar group of people to talk about a country about which, certainly in Washington and most certainly in the United States, there's really very little serious analysis, let alone knowledge. So we are delighted to open with Carlos, to pass the palabra to Steve, and end with Kathy, and then welcome your comments and questions. There are bios on the table outside, so I will not take the time to introduce people, especially if you have the sheet of paper in front of you. I'd also like to mention that there are a number of Wilson Center publications that we hope you'll take with you when you leave. If you're interested, there are a number that are available only as electronic publications, so please leave the sample copy that's been printed out for others to take a look at, and then anyone who wants a copy can download it from our website. Thank you again for joining us. Without further ado, Carlos.
Thank you very much. Thanks for being here. Cindy, thanks for hosting this and for organizing this. And I'm very grateful and happy to be at the Wilson Center. It has been a fantastic experience. And I am extremely happy also because I am here with two of my co-authors. With Steve, we work a lot to put together this. It took us like over 6 years, almost 7 years, to put together the Ecuador Reader, and it was fun overall. We had a great time, and with Kathy, we have been working on the media in Correa for the past 2 years. So it's great to have them here. And what I want to talk to today is about populism in Ecuador, because populism has been a recurrent phenomenon in Ecuador, and it's part of some of the articles that we have in the Ecuador Reader, and I also will use that category to characterize Correa's government, Correa's style of governing. And because populism is such a complicated, charged word, let me explain you what I do not mean by populism, and then I will tell you how do I understand populism. I do not use this term to dequalify economic policies as irrational. In general, when people follow economic policies that do not follow the Washington consensus, they have said that they are populist and they are going to lead to disaster. So I'm not using the term populism that way. I'm not using the term populism to talk about irrational masses that are seduced by charismatic, irrational charlatans. I do not use populism in that sense either. I use the term populism to talk about a particular type of political discourse, a political discourse by means of which society becomes differentiated into two antagonistic camps, the people against the oligarchy. They are presented as antagonistic, meaning they are enemies, they are not adversaries who share a political space in the polity. And leaders such as Velasco Ibarra, Assad Bucaran, and Abdallah Bucaran, Lucio Gutierrez, and Rafael Correa have used populist discourses. The second point that I want to make is that populism has been one of the most important democratizing forces in the history of Ecuador and in Latin America. Velasco Ibarra, for instance, the president who started populism in Ecuador in the 1930s and 40s, he expanded the franchise, he fought against electoral fraud, and Correa's citizen revolution is following this tradition. He has expanded the constitution approved by this government, has expanded social and civil rights. They have also increased the franchise. Now people that are 16 can vote, which is very interesting. He has also allowed prisoners and members of the police and armed forces to vote. So the franchise has been increased. Populism has also been a democratizing force because this populist rhetoric that presents the people as the essence of the nation has allowed common people to present their own autonomous demands in the political system. And Steve Striffer, in his book on the United Fruit Company and in the chapter that is in the Ecuador Reader, he shows how common peasants in Ecuador used the discourse of Velasco Ibarra for agrarian reform to take over the Tenguel plantation of the United Fruit in the 1960s. So populism not only increases the franchise, it also can empower people. And it remains to be seen whether or not the opening of the political system, the adulation of common people, will allow common people to present their autonomous claims under Correa's government, or if Correa will follow a top-down strategy of mobilization. Populism has also been portrayed as the nightmare of democracy. The name of Velasco Ibarra became synonymous with political instability. He only completed one term of his 5 terms in office. And populist politicians have not respected the rules of the democratic game. Velasco Ibarra, who advocated liberalism in his writings, staged 2 coup d'etats. He closed newspapers, jailed his opponents, and used his followers to intimidate the opposition. Similarly, Rafael Correa's government in 2007 semi-legally got rid of 57 congressional opposition members, closed the Congress, and Correa has used a confrontational language against the opposition and against the media, calling journalists incompetent, mediocre, corrupt, and savage beasts. And so, because populism has been conceived as dangerous to democracy, modernizing social democratic and Christian democratic elites in the late 1970s transition to democracy wanted to create a political system free of populism. Their goal was to replace personalistic for ideological parties, to forbid the re-election of presidents, and to create strong institutions to do not allow the populist menace to constantly return to the nation. Their plan, alas, failed. Political parties continued to rely on clientelism, parties became personalistic more than ideological, and new political messiahs kept on appearing. Abdallah Bucaram got to power in 1996 and lasted in the presidency only 6 months. He was kicked out of power illegally because he used to call himself the crazy one. Congress said that he's crazy, and they removed him without medical proofs that he was crazy indeed, and only with a simple majority of votes in the Congress. In 2002, Ecuadorians chose again an outsider, Colonel Lucio Gutierrez, who ran on an anti-political and nationalist discourse, and his fate was the same as Bucaram, as his predecessor, Jamil Maguad, who was not a populist but a Harvard-trained technocrat. He was kicked out of power with a simple majority of votes in the Congress that said that he has abandoned power, and it was false. He was still in the presidential palace. And after Gutierrez, Ecuadorians again chose another populist, Correa, who ran on a ticket against, promising to Congress to close Congress and without presenting candidates for the Congress. Now, what are the commonalities and difference between all of these forms of populism? What are their effects on democracy? And why do Ecuadorians continue to support populist politicians? If populism is a rhetoric that confronts the people against the oligarchy, we have to see who is the people. The people is not a sociological category. It's a rhetorical concept. So it has changed. For Velasco Ibarra, the people was understood in political terms, those whose will was not respected in the polls due to electoral fraud. Since CFP in the 1940s, the people was conceived in social terms, in sociological terms, as the poor and as the mestizo poor. In both conceptualizations of the people, in Velasco Ibarra's and in Bucaram's conceptualization of the people, indigenous people and Afro-Ecuadorians were not included in the nation as people who have their own autonomous culture and identity. They were sort of invited to be part of the mestizo nation, but their specificity was not acknowledged. Indigenous people were for the first time part of the people and the essence of the people when they gave a coup d'etat with Colonel Gutierrez in 2000. Then they became the incarnation of the people struggling against neoliberalism. But with Correa, I think that the mestizo notion of the people has come back. Even though Correa speaks some Quichua, his policies have been more based on social class redistribution. He has opposed the recognition of Quechua as an official language. Bilingual education is no longer controlled by the indigenous movement, is nowadays controlled by the Ministry of Education, and bilingual education was the most important demand of the indigenous movement. And in many speeches, Correa has said that nowadays that the right has disappeared, the main enemies to the revolutionary process are the leadership of the indigenous movement, or some of the leaders of the indigenous movement, and radical ecologists. Populists have conceived democracy as the occupation of public spaces in the name of a leader constructed as the incarnation of democratic ideals. The populist myth that sovereignty resides in the vox populi, that does not need institutional mediations, inspire crowds and congressmen to remove elected presidents such as Bucaram, Maguad, and Gutierrez. And populists have legitimized their rule in elections. Similarly to Chavez, Correa has embarked in a permanent political campaign. I mean, he has to win many elections in order to displace the previous elite and to consolidate his hegemony. And his government has been based on the confrontational language of politics as a confrontation between enemies, instead of searching pacts between political adversaries. And the government has lived according to a myth that the people is struggling against imperialism, local elites, the media, and other enemies. When they run of external enemies, the enemies have been inside the coalition. Because elections are imagined as gargantuan revolutionary battles against the forces of evil, Correa has little patience respecting the rules of the electoral game. State funds have been used to promote official candidates, and these elections have taken place in conditions where it has been difficult for the opposition to play in an even field. Like most Ecuadorian politicians, and Correa is not unique on this, he has not followed the rule of the law or the norms and procedures of democracy. Why does populism appear? Most political scientists say that it has to do with weakly institutionalized political parties, especially when you create very strong executives. But I don't think that institutional design is the only reason behind the appearance of populist challenges. State deficiencies, understood as the inability of the state to fulfill basic governance, legal, and security functions, also explains the rise of populism. The rule of law does not regulate interactions between citizens and the state. The rich are above the laws, and they can only use the laws to their convenience. For instance, in Ecuador, you can only, when the police stop you and when you have any problem, you can only say, do you know with whom you are talking to? And of course, if you are an important person, you are above the law. You are not anybody. You are not a normal citizen. You are above the law. Laws have been drafted in such a way that most of the population has to break rules and regulations in order to make a living, selling in the street, because most people have to make a living in the informal sector, or building houses by illegally occupying lands. People who live on the margin of the law, however, are not totally ignored by the state. They are governed by a series of agencies that do not interact with them as citizens who have rights and duties, but as population with particular and specific needs. State agencies have labeled and stigmatized these populations as informals, land invaders, and the dangerous poor. Populism transformed the humiliations that the poor have to endure in everyday life and transformed the land invader, the informal, into the source of the nations, into the essence of the nations. The poor, the informal, the marginal become el pueblo, understood as the virtuous incarnation of all of the good attributes of the nation. And those who constantly humiliate the poor become the hideous oligarchy, the pelucones in Correa's words. As long as there is no rule of law, as long as common people are economic and legally poor, as long as institutional designs favor strong executives, populism will not go away and will continue to flourish. I think that Correa's government faces a series of dilemmas now. On the one hand, they have promised a citizens' revolution and a better democracy based on participation. But on the other, Correa has been manufactured as the embodiments of the citizens' revolution. He incarnates the citizens' revolution. His government has also favored top-down mobilization and is uncomfortable with autonomous grassroots participation, particularly of more radical groups such as ecologists and or the leadership of the indigenous movement. Finally, the call for a revolution has transformed politics into an ethical struggle between antagonistic camps. Pluralism, tolerance, and the respect for institutional mediations are succumbing to the power of a leader who claims to embody the will of the people and who has promised to redeem the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve, please.
Okay, well, thanks. I don't know, my comments are going to be fairly short and I guess somewhat general. First, thanks a lot for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be here. I'd also like to thank Carlos for being such a wonderful co-editor. As he sort of suggested, it was a long project, and I was somewhat naive, I think, going into it in terms of I guess thinking of it more as an edited book than a reader, and readers are quite, I guess, a different beast in many ways, and Carlos sort of provided inspiration at key moments that kind of kept the project alive, at least for me. One of the challenges I think involved in putting together something like this is kind of the breadth of the topic, in the sense that anything and everything within the past and present of Ecuadorian history is sort of on the table for being included. And aside, I think, from being sort of an impossible task, it's actually kind of a bizarre task. That is to create a relatively readable and not too long book that provides a relatively well-rounded vision of an entire country for all of its history in a more complex way than a U.S. reader, I think, in particular, would get sort of from the mainstream media or from, I guess, U.S. government sources kind of as well. That would be accessible to a general audience, but also still have some interest to kind of experts on the region as well. So it's a rather, difficult task, but that's sort of the essence of the reader. One of the things I think we struggled with, or at least, I think we both sort of thought about this, was the desire that I think we both had in some ways, was to include contemporary events that we thought needed critical analysis, and that maybe different folks, not simply us, but other folks had sort of had something to say about those events that would benefit a general audience, while at the same time not producing a reader that was too current eventy. I think the idea in some ways is to produce something that, at least, or go for contributions that have some sort of timeless quality to them, like a great piece of literature or something along those lines, while at the same time saying something about the present as well. I think it was particularly tough not to add more of those critical analyses, I think particularly sort of along the lines of Carlos's discussion, because the contemporary period is so fascinating. It's particularly interesting. It didn't take us quite 10 years to complete this, but it strikes me how much, at least on the surface and probably quite a bit deeper, how profoundly Ecuador and Latin America have really changed sort of during the decade when we were kind of putting this thing together. That is, at least politically, we're in a place, I think, that in some ways was really difficult to imagine 10 years ago, which in some ways is, I think, fairly remarkable. When we were starting the Reader, protest movements were certainly widespread in Latin America. Neoliberalism was kind of under attack at that moment. And there were certainly shifts in kind of party and governmental kinds of alliances that were interesting and I think maybe foreshadowed what was to come, but certainly weren't entirely coherent, I don't think, in the sense maybe that they become, or maybe coherent's not quite the right word. But in the intervening period, it did consolidate, I think, into a fairly clear turn, certainly to the left in Latin America and Ecuador as well. That is, despite their diversity, kind of leftist populist leaders and the popular forces that they're in some ways tied to seem relatively committed to social and democratic reforms that emphasize more equitable resource distribution, social welfare programs aimed to combat poverty and inequality, increased autonomy from the U.S. on some level, an engagement with globalization, at least kind of on different terms, and a democratic process whereby those elected are actually held somewhat accountable for their campaign promises. And this is, I think, a very different political scene in Latin America than we saw kind of when we began this project. And it's sort of, I think, worth noting. Yet, the reason for me, at least why it was so tempting to include more analyses of current events, is not simply that the events themselves, I think, seem transformative, and I think they are, but that the mainstream sources that most Americans might turn to in order to learn about Ecuador and Latin America seem particularly unsophisticated. And even kind of by the low standard of the corporate media that we have, or I think also as well by some of the political outlets that get this information. And that, I think, is a goal of the Reader, is to provide a more nuanced understanding of Ecuador or of the country in question. And although academics are hardly of one mind, I think, when it comes to the recent political shifts within Latin America in terms of how profound they are, or how cohesive they've been, or how long they're going to last, or even kind of what they are. It does seem clear to me, and certainly I'm willing to be critical of academics, but at least on this, it strikes me that we've come a long ways in our discussions of populism and the left, and that it's equally clear, at least from my own kind of opinion, how little progress has been made in terms of how populism or the left is understood in most of the mainstream media in the United States and much of the mainstream media in Latin America, actually, as well, I think, and I think also within government circles, too. Maybe this isn't surprising that the U.S. media gets Latin America wrong. They've been doing so for quite a long time. But I think right now, sort of the collective analysis of what's currently going on, at least from my reading, seems particularly misguided and ideological in certain ways. And I find this both kind of from reading the media, but also from what my students kind of bring to the class in terms of their understandings of kind of what's going on in Latin America as well. And again, I think that's a reason maybe why something like the Reader has a place. This isn't to say, I think, as Carlos was suggesting too, that all is well in Ecuador, or that Correa or some of these other populists represent some sort of savior. But in a country where presidents were being ushered out of office really on a yearly basis when we were putting this Reader together, Correa's successful reelection could be seen or could be taken as evidence that something's working in Ecuador. That is, where people vote for change, they get some change, they have expectations that more will come, and then they vote for someone again. And that seems to be sort of, I think, what's, in a very simplistic way, what's kind of gone on. Or at least lead us to a slightly more sophisticated understanding of populism than I think we've been commonly given. Still, and this is why I think the Reader's resistance maybe to current events is kind of useful. It's also worth remembering how much of kind of what was true about Ecuador 10 years ago I think is still kind of with us in many ways. That is, despite strong nods towards protectionism and debt relief, Ecuador remains highly dependent on the world economy through ways that are not only reminiscent of the past, that is, through export commodities such as cacao, bananas, shrimp, flowers, of course, oil. Remittances and tourism are also big, all of which are plummeting kind of in the current economic crisis, but that also provide governments kind of regardless of their political persuasion with relatively little room to maneuver and relatively little room kind of for error. And similarly, I think despite over kind of a decade of intense popular organization, workers kind of throughout all sectors of Ecuadorian society really still struggle for basic rights. Rights to organize, health care, decent wages, and much of the population remains economically marginalized. And that is to say, Ecuador, as Velasco Ibarra did say, remains a very difficult place to govern, but it also, I think, for many Ecuadorians, remains a very difficult place to live, and that hasn't changed either. Still, as the Reader makes clear throughout the kind of 500-plus years of history that it covers, Ecuadorians have established remarkably powerful organizations and movements that have continually put forth new challenges and demands to entrench forms of power, that have continually, while pushing democracy forward in less than perfect ways. Ecuador's history is far too complex to reduce to a single contradiction, but the contradiction between, on the one hand, advocates of economic regimes and political systems that benefit only a really small and restricted sector of the population, versus those fighting, I think, oligarchy, if maybe not always capitalism, but those pushing for more democratic political and economic forms, this contradiction does seem to be particularly sharp, or has been kind of within the last 10 years, and I think more so than it was when we began. It's unclear how this struggle will be resolved in Ecuador and elsewhere in Latin America, or how this democratic path will, kind of in very real and sort of deep ways, be able to decisively really distance itself from neoliberalism particularly in a small country like Ecuador. But a set of ideas are now on, or at least back on the table, in a way that really was almost, I think, unimaginable 10 years ago. And those include notions about generating politically and economically inclusive market economies that promote investment while protecting private property and natural resources, creating economic growth and jobs, guaranteeing basic individual, social, and human rights, that the idea that some form of political authority needs to regulate the market and secure at least a level of income redistribution, that democracy requires sort of a vigilant population to kind of keep public authorities in check, that is, to find ways to hold public institutions accountable, and that Latin American countries kind of need to find better terms for international trade. Those all seem to be on the table and really have gained widespread acceptance on a level that I think was kind of unimaginable when we began this on some basic level. An explanation or historical understanding as to why they have and how ordinary Ecuadorians have kind of made this happen can hopefully be gleaned from the pages of the reader. A reader that we hope provides a better understanding of how Ecuadorians have attempted to make their worlds, politically, economically, but also artistically and culturally. Ecuadorians have not shaped their worlds as they please, or necessarily with pure motives and intentions, but neither have they sat by and waited for global events to overtake them. Faced with considerable obstacles, including a particularly difficult present characterized by considerable poverty and economic crisis, Ecuadorians continue to chart independent, though often contradictory, visions of the future. The country remains plagued by rigid hierarchies, but those hierarchies are being challenged with perhaps unprecedented intensity. Over time, Ecuador has been profoundly democratized by popular struggles. Yet democratic institutions remain in a fragile state, even as growing numbers of Ecuadorians seem to agree that democracy, without some semblance of social equality and economic security, is precarious at best. The challenge of deepening Ecuadorian democracy is ever present, and I think at a particularly crucial moment. Thank you.
Catherine.
I have a few handouts, if you could just.
Sure. Pass them around.
Yeah, let me apologize ahead of time. I have just a single-page handout. Perhaps people can sort of look on together because I'm not sure there's quite enough for the entire room. But okay, well, thank you, Cynthia and the Wilson Center. It's great to be here again, and thank you, my friends, for inviting me to be with you on this happy occasion. I should say, as a plug for the book, there are many, many good reasons to buy the Ecuador Reader. One of those reasons is that there are a couple of great recipes for ceviche in the book. So, apart from everything else, you can find that too. At any rate, 2009, I think, is the perfect year to welcome the publication of the Ecuadorian Reader, and that's because 30 years ago this August, Ecuador became one of the first countries in the region to shake off military rule and to make a transition to democracy. And I think, as we all know, all anniversaries and probably birthdays too always invite a reflection on the sort of traditional theme of change and continuity. And so our gathering today to celebrate the Ecuador Reader seems like a very appropriate occasion both to look backward and look forward with regard to the state of Ecuadorian democracy. I think it's fair to say that the Correa presidency, which, as all of you know, has been in place now since January 2007 and will continue to be in place now until 2013, thanks to the victory that Correa just won several weeks ago, taking 51% of the vote in his re-election bid. So he will stay there. And his presidency has been many things to many people at the same time. It's been dramatic. It's been surprising. It's been unsettling of the past. And I think it's fair to say upsetting at the same time to many. Correa clearly projects his experiment as a radical transformative project. If you look at the statement he made immediately following the declaration of his victory just a few weeks ago, Correa called for a further radicalization of his citizens' revolution as his primary objective now. And he has reiterated his commitment in the weeks since to fight against what he terms the corrupt oligarchy, who, in his view, produced what was a surprising 28% of the vote for his rival Lucio Gutierrez. So he's portrayed the Gutierrez candidacy as being one supported by what's left of the corrupt oligarchy that he remains committed to fight. In keeping with this theme of continuity and change, then, I'd just like to take a few minutes here to take a stab at constructing something of a presidential scorecard. And I think in Washington in recent weeks, that's been a favorite pastime to score the first 100 days. And so in that spirit, I'll take a stab at doing something like that, except we're scoring 2 years rather than 100 days. And hopefully the scorecard will help give us some sense of the kinds of changes that are underway under the Correa presidency. And we could put a lot of different categories on the scorecard, but for purposes of brevity, let me just say that my scorecard here is surrounded, is based on thinking about whether Correa has been successful in resolving what I see as three fundamental problems that have dogged Ecuadorian democracy since the 1979 transition. And so let me just talk about these three problems. The first problem, which for lack of a better word, I'll call the problem of parties and governance. The second problem has to do with the problem of judicial instability and the continued interruptions in the functioning, especially of the Supreme Court. And thirdly, whether or not what he's done to solve what is a classic problem, not just in Ecuador, but all over Latin America, the classic problem of corruption. So let me just take a brief trot through these three problems and offer some reflections. I think, as many of you know, for those of you who are interested in Ecuador, Ecuador's party system has played a major role in generating the country's periodic crises of governability over the last 30 years. That party system is one of the most fragmented party systems in Latin America, featuring very high levels of electoral volatility, so voters like to flip from election to election, from party to party. But the problem in the party system doesn't reside exclusively in the number of parties and having so many parties, but also in the nature of the parties themselves. That is, many of these parties have been created as personalistic vehicles for particular leaders with little programmatic coherence to go with it. Now, there have been parties in this over the last 30 years that have achieved a kind of stable reproduction of themselves. The Partido Social Cristiano, for example, the Social Christian Party, the Izquierda Democrática for a long time, the Social Democratic Party, and of course the Christian Democrats, Democracia Popular, also reproduced themselves. The PRE, Bucaram's party, also did that fairly well for a long time. But the problem, even with these stable parties, was that they had tended to have their support concentrated geographically. So the Social Christian Party was really an enclave party of the coast, as was the PRE, Bucaram's party. And in contrast, the Izquierda Democrática, the Social Democrats, and the Christian Democrats had their enclave of support in the Sierra, in the interior region of the country. So that party conflict always had this sort of underlay or overlay, depending upon how you look at it, of regional antagonism, and that was a chronic problem in this system. So this fragmented, volatile, regionally dispersed party system in the context of a presidential system was always a kind of witch's brew. For the most part, presidents could not count on stable majorities, and that translated into chronic executive legislative stalemates and standoffs, and also a lot of corruption as presidents tried to buy their way into majorities. And it also tempted the legislature to remove presidents, and Carlos referred to this in his talk, to remove presidents really without proper impeachment processes. Okay, so there's more to say about that, but for the purposes of brevity, has Correa then resolved, can we say, has he resolved this party's governance problem, this executive legislative stalemate problem? Well, if we were scoring him on a checklist, I think we'd probably, at least to date, we'd have to put a yes, a tick, a yes, in this column. In 2006, Correa was elected and was able to take full advantage of the very discredited state of the party system, not just to win the presidency, but then to basically shut down the sitting Congress and push forward with his plans for constitutional reform, for a constitutional assembly. And in that constitutional assembly, he had a flat-out majority. He rendered all other, what was left of the traditional parties, irrelevant in the process of writing the Constitution. And in the interregnum after the Constitutional Assembly, traditional parties were also rendered ineffective by virtue of the ability of his organization, País, to control the so-called Congresillo, which was the truncated assembly that has been governing in this interim period. He's also controlled legislative processes there, and so effectively he's had the best of all possible worlds when it comes to the state of legislative action. Now, what happened a few weeks ago in the recent elections in terms of the future composition of Congress, I wish I could tell you exactly, but we're still waiting for the final results for what is now called not the Congress, but the Assembly. We're still waiting on those results. It looks like, from what we can tell, that PAIS, which is Correa's organization, may have anywhere from 50 to 60, 61 representatives in the Assembly, which will leave him a tad short of having a majority. So this was a somewhat disappointing result for PAIS. But when you look at the distribution, what we think is the distribution of other seats, he will probably be able to reach out to allies in leftist parties like the MPD, perhaps if there are some representatives of Bucaram's PRE, other smaller parties. So it looks like he will be able to put together, with PAIS being the dominant force, of course, a left-leaning coalition in the upcoming Assembly. But should the Assembly, now, all of you know, party discipline has been a chronic problem in Ecuadorian politics. So what if he has a problem with party discipline in his own PAIS organization? I don't think we have a lot of indications that that is going to be a problem. He's been fairly successful at maintaining his domination over his own organization. But should the new assembly become obstreperous vis-a-vis the president, the new constitution that is now in place gives Correa a significant club to wield in a fight with Congress, and that's the threat to call snap elections. The president now has the power to call an election one time during his 4-year term, and the language of the Constitution gives him a lot of discretionary power in determining the conditions for calling that snap election. So, for example, if the new national court, the Corte Nacional that replaces the Supreme Court, if the new constitutional court were to determine that the legislature acted unconstitutionally, that can be the condition for calling an election. Another condition for calling these snap elections could be if there's a determination made that the Congress has created obstacles to the realization of the National Development Plan. That can be a condition for calling the election, or simplemente por graves crisis política. So there's a lot of broad language that would allow Correa to call a snap election. Now, if he calls a snap election, he also has to go to an election himself. So, but I think that constitutes less of a problem for him for some of the reasons that Carlos and I have written about when we've written about this sort of permanent campaign of Correa, that he has a substantial, public relations apparatus, and certainly he has significant resources at his disposal in the state, and so he would be at much less of a disadvantage in a new electoral cycle than representatives from the assembly would be. So everyone, I think, believes that will be a disincentive for the new assembly to act up if they were of a mind to against the president. I should say the new constitution also explicitly stipulates that a 2/3 majority has to be in place in order to boot out a president for any reasons, and that includes mental incapacity. And so that stipulation wasn't in place for Bucaram. Now it is. So it's just going to be much harder to put together a majority to boot out a president. So I don't think we should be, although I think it's fair to say that the results that we saw several weeks ago, the results for PAIS in the assembly election were a bit disappointing. It was less than they had hoped for. But I don't think we should be too quick in concluding that those results mean that Correa necessarily will confront some kind of roadblock in the Congress. So I would give him a tick in the up column in terms of resolving executive legislative stalemates. On the second matter, and Cynthia, you can just cut me off if I'm going too long here. On the second matter, has Correa resolved the long-standing problem of judicial instability in Ecuador? Ecuador has a very, very long history that predates the transition to democracy, in fact, of contentious politics when it comes to selecting Supreme Court justices and organizing the court. Between 1970 and 1988, the judicial branch was restructured no less than 7 times in that time frame, in 18 years. As all of you may recall, the catalyst for the overthrow of Lucio Gutierrez was precisely his decision to go along with stacking the court, which allowed for the freedom for Bucaram to come back, and for a court already plagued by serious legitimacy problems. That decision was, of course, a disaster, not just for him politically, but it was also a disaster for the court. After the overthrow of Gutierrez, Ecuador had no sitting, functioning Supreme Court for 8 months, and that has generated a backlog of cases that has yet to be resolved. The new constitution replaces the old Supreme Court with a new court that's now called the Corte Nacional de Justicia. It's made up of 21 members, so they've reduced it from the 30-some members of the former court. They'll serve a single 9-year term. Now, the court that's sitting right now is still an interim court based on the old Supreme Court, so we haven't gone through the process of constituting the new Corte Nacional yet. But the new court that is slated to be chosen is supposed to be done so through a merit competition that will be organized by another body called the Consejo de la Judicatura. But it's important to note that the Consejo de la Judicatura itself is not functioning. It's just in an interim state, so the new Consejo de Judicatura is not functioning yet. But that Consejo itself will be chosen by the new so-called fifth power in the Ecuadorian state, and that's the Consejo de Participación Ciudadana y Control Social. And this is an organization that itself is made up of representatives of civil society. It's it's quite small. It's a 7-member group. They've just recently been chosen and put into place. So, and you can see that if you have the diagram in front of you, a little bit about how this works. But it's fair to say that all expectations are that the government will be able to dominate this commission process by virtue of the fact that the government itself would have 5 representatives on the commission that will choose then the Consejo de Judicatura, which in turn will choose the court. And there's also 5 citizen representatives that will be chosen in what is supposed to be almost a lottery-like process, although that has not yet, there's been no determination exactly about how that process is going to work. At any rate, my point is that it appears that Correa will have a certain success, or is bound to have a certain success in wrenching judicial appointments from the legislature, and that has always been, a point of great contention. So he has all the power to sort of wrench now. He's basically removed the legislature from the process of choosing the Supreme Court. So in that sense, it appears that Correa has resolved this problem of instability in the judiciary and this problem of having constant political struggle over Supreme Court appointments among different parties. Now, whether this new system for making judicial appointments will produce an independent judiciary, that is, a judiciary that willing to take on the executive if necessary, remains to be seen. We simply don't know how this process is really going to work out yet, and so I guess I would put a question mark beside on the judicial column. And this brings me to my final and third related question: has Correa resolved the chronic problem of corruption in Ecuador, which has been a constantly destabilizing issue? You'll recall that corruption, and Carlos has mentioned this, corruption was a central catalyst for the removal of Bucaram in 1997. Corruption also loomed large as an issue in the removal of Mawad in 2000, as well as the corrupt practices of Gutierrez in trying to stack the Supreme Court in 2005. So corruption has been a chronic issue in this destabilized kind of politics, or this politics of people going to the street to remove presidents. What has Correa done vis-a-vis corruption? I think to date, and we're looking at sort of 2 years of an administration now. To date, I don't think we've seen terribly scandalous accusations emerge in relation to on economic and financial questions so far. There have been, for example, the current, a former sports minister is now under judicial investigation for kickbacks. I think it's fair to say, though, when we look at sort of the politics of scandal in the Correa administration for the first 2 years, the biggest single scandal has been in the realm of national security, and that has to do with the question of who knew what and when about the presence of the FARC encampments in Ecuador, the Colombian guerrillas. And so in terms of important scandals, that's been the biggest one, but it's been in the realm of national security, not in terms of finance and economics. For what it's worth, it's important to keep in mind that Transparency International, its findings in 2008 ranked Ecuador as one of the worst cases in Latin America, ranking in at number 151, which made it actually worse than Paraguay and Nicaragua. So for what it's worth, and those measures are always contested, corruption is still considered to be a major problem.
They're only number 143.
So what inroads has Correa made in constructing some kind of anti-corruption apparatus in the state? At the beginning of his administration, Correa created a Secretaría Nacional Anticorrupción. That, in turn, has been replaced more recently by the Secretaría de Transparencia. I think it's fair to say that not much came out of either of those two entities. The new constitution swept away what was left of the old anti-corruption commission, which was called the Comisión de Control Cívico de la Corrupción, the CCCC. And that commission actually had hundreds and hundreds of pending investigations on their files, but that agency has been swept away. The locus of the new anti-corruption apparatus is found once again in this fifth power of the state, in the Consejo de Participación Ciudadana. One of their many constitutionally prescribed functions is to investigate allegations of corruption and provide that information to legal authorities for prosecution. Now, the newly elected president of this Consejo de Participación, Julio Guaman, admitted publicly that his new consejo is nowhere near capable of taking over the pending portfolio that was left behind by the former CCCC, and so it's unlikely that we're going to really see much in the way of follow-up of those hundreds of cases. They're a new office, and they're simply not prepared to really take on those cases in any serious way right now. Along with its investigative duties, this Consejo de Participación is also important to anti-corruption efforts by virtue of its role in making appointments. And it makes appointments it helps organize the process for the Supreme Court, but it also helps organize a commission process that will select many other important jobs, including the Controller General, the Defensor del Pueblo, the Attorney General, the Fiscal General. And this Consejo will also select among the president's nominees for such jobs as the Procurador General and the heads of the Superintendentes de Bancos, de Compañías, etc. So they have a very important role in helping to select the people who, in theory, should head anti-corruption efforts in other parts of the state. I would add another question. Now, the obvious question is, what degree of independence or relative autonomy will all these new anti-corruption appointees have, especially when they're coming out of an appointment process that will be largely controlled or at least largely influenced by the executive branch? That's a question mark. We don't know because these things haven't happened yet. Let me just add a final question here, too, when we talk about the issue of corruption. So if there's a prospective problem here with horizontal accountability, that is the ability of parts of the government to check the conduct of the executive, what are the prospects for what we could think of as societal accountability? That is, are there groups in civil society that have the capacity to act as effective watchdogs on this process? Now, in this regard, I think we need to consider what I would call the weakened, perhaps, state or the troubled state of the Ecuadorian press right now. And Carlos has referred to that. Maybe we can talk about more in the questions. Certainly, Correa has not suppressed the press in the sense of having journalists in jail or anything even close to that. But he has been successful in basically what I think of as kind of shouting down contesting voices in the press. Since becoming president, he's engaged in a very concerted campaign to confront his critics in the press, calling them out journalists out by name and calling them very nasty names, but also calling out outlets altogether. So he's been very denunciatory in his relationship, for example, with the most important newspaper on the coast, El Universo. So what I'm describing here is, troubling potential insofar as you have an institutional situation in which the prospects for horizontal accountability, the ability of government to check itself, I think are in question, coupled with what is starting to look like, and this is perhaps we can talk about this more, a weakened capacity for societal accountability. Now, with all that said, there is a lot that we don't know about how the Correa experiment is going to turn out. We're just at the beginning of this process now of seeing how the new constitution will actually be implemented. So we're at the beginning of a new phase. It's important to keep in mind that we've just concluded 2 years of effectively what were serial elections, election after election. And so now it seems to me the Correa administration is getting down to whatever brass tacks or whatever the proper expression there would be, and that is facing the very hard task of slogging through day-to-day governance in a context of growing economic crisis. And so whether this government will be able to muddle through, and I think there's probably good prospects that we'll see a kind of process of muddling through, is something that we're going to wait to see. And just by way of conclusion, I think after 30 years of working on Ecuadorian politics, I remember the day when I was in the Plaza de San Francisco listening to the inaugural speeches of Jaime Rodós and Osvaldo Hurtado. Remember them with great nostalgia now. And after 30 years of watching this process myself, I would be foolish to end with any kind of predictions. And so I won't.
Great. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks to all three speakers for helping us dig a little bit further beneath the surface of our understanding of Ecuadorian politics. We'd like to invite comments and questions from those of you who are in the audience. Please identify yourself for the benefit of the speakers and also for our recording. Sure. Norman Bailey.
Yes, that's my name.
Yes.
Institute of World Politics. I think one thing that has surprised many of us is the complete unpredictability of President Correa. And he seems to take measures and do things which don't make a lot of sense, even from the populist standpoint. He is clearly in the orbit of Hugo Chavez, but he doesn't want to join ALBA. Okay. He violates WTO rules for no really very good reason. He defaults, even though Ecuador has enough reserves to pay its debts, thereby effectively excluding Ecuador from the international capital market. He picks fights with, for example, Brazil. Why? What for? That kind of behavior leads people to think that even if Bucaram was not mentally unstable, Correa is. There have been various explanations. I mean that he's resentido because of what happened with his father. I mean that, who knows about all this psychobabble, whether there's any reality to it. But I would be extremely interested whether any of the panelists have an explanation for this, excessively strange behavior on the part of the president.
Take one or two others on the table if there's someone who wants to follow Norman. Margarita.
Thank you. They've been wonderful, the presentations. I wanted to make two questions. One has to do with the concept of participation. How has it been developing in Ecuador? What is the purpose of the participation? You talked a little bit about the fiscalization of corruption and the naming of certain authorities, but does it have this conception, like in Venezuela, of self-development, of widening citizenship to make us a responsible citizen? And I mean, how has it been focused in these laws, the idea of participation? And the other one has to do with the populism. Conceptually, I would like to ask Carlos, what is his opinion of what is the result of this populism? What could the results, the consequences be? Because in theory they say that populism only takes us to authoritarianism or anarchy. I would like to hear a little bit about what you think could be the exit of some of these, of this kind of new brand of populism.
It's Margarita Lopez Maya from the Universidad Central de Venezuela, also a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow this year. Let's take this gentleman here, and then I'm going to take the prerogative of the floor to ask a question, and we'll come back. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. My name is Ken Polsky from Catholic Relief Services, and not surprisingly, my question is about the role of the Catholic Church in Ecuador. How do you see their role in terms of either resisting or facilitating the mobilization that's going on, or as a mechanism of vertical accountability?
Okay. And then my question, without having read the Ecuadorian Reader, is that if you had to give a short answer to explain the chronic instability of Ecuadorian politics, is there a particular factor? I mean, Catherine and several of you have mentioned things like weak institutions and the lack of horizontal and societal accountability. Coming from a similar sort of case study on Colombia, for example, people talked about the lack of state control over all parts of the territory, which was more a description than an explanation for why guerrillas and paramilitaries and narcos had been able to take over. And I was wondering if there is a similarly agreed upon or pithy explanation for why, until Correa, was reelected, presidents were in office for a year, maybe two, and then thrown out. So let's take those 4 questions, and we'll come back and have more. Who wants to start? I don't want to start. Carlos, why don't you take the question about populism and address some of Margarita's?
Yeah, let me start. We'll try to answer all of the questions. And let me start with the unpredictability of Correa. I think that Correa is, to understand Correa, I think that it's fundamental to see that he has been, Kathy and I have been writing about this, in a permanent political campaign. So his unpredictability, all of these excesses, all of these attacks, all of this looking for enemies, all of this excessive nationalism, all of this is done with the aim of winning votes. And I think that Correa, on the other hand, he's on a permanent campaign, but his permanent campaign is being ruled by a group of experts in media manipulation. The most important member of the cabinet is Vinicio Alvarado, a publicist. Correa he doesn't do anything without looking at what opinion polls are saying. He has an intelligent guy doing opinion polls. Of course, he failed on predicting that Lucio Gutierrez was going to get so many votes. But anyway, nobody can predict Lucio Gutierrez. I think the pollsters can never do it. They should improve their ways, but I don't know. So I think that he's embarking this scientific permanent campaign, and he's also very pragmatic. The Ecuadorian government has an incredible number of people in the social sciences there. Half of Flaxo, where I teach, is in the government. The other half is in the opposition. We stay in the building of Flaxo, but they are technocrats. Some of them have only a few, but a few of them have PhDs or at least master's degrees. And for what an Ecuadorian government has looked like, they are very literate. They are well-read. So it's this combination of being a permanent campaign, very pragmatic, but using strategically all of these acts of craziness, I think. what will explain the chronic instability of Ecuador? Well, there has been a series of answers, right? Correa and his people will go, because most of them are economists, they will go to dependency theory and say that it has to do with economic dependency and the cycles of boom and bust. Other people have focused on institutional aspects, and I think that they have a very important answer there, the way in which institutions have been designed, and this might explain that Correa's government might be more stable, but at the cost of creating a form of democracy in which you do not have independence of power, in which it's very difficult to make the president accountable, in which there is increasing control of everything in the hands of the executive. So it's very complicated. And I also think that this instability has to do with the particular ways in which state and society have been related, the lack of a rule of law, the fact that you don't have citizens with rights and duties. And even though Correa is promising a citizens' revolution, and that could be very promising, right? In a way, you can see that the Correa's revolution is a Correa to create a strong state. It's to create, it's a project on a state formation. So you will expect it to create rules for everybody, but Correa himself never abides to the rules that his party has created, because he didn't like the radical provisions in the constitution that forbid mineral exploration. He got his members of the alliance to get rid of that. So I don't know how much we're going to have the rule of law with the government. And the Catholic Church has, Correa is a Catholic, and to understand Correa, you have to understand his strong Catholicism. He's not a leftist that has been a militant of left-wing parties. He became a leftist by doing missionary work with the Salesian Fathers. He's a practicing Catholic. That's why he opposed the feminist and gay demands for gay marriage and or abortion. Also, opinion polls say that those things were not going to fly. So, but there is also that conviction there. In the moment of the campaign for the referendum campaign for the Constitution, he entered into a fight against sections of the church, especially the sections of the church that are considered to be more conservative and that were claiming and lying that the Constitution is very pro-abortion, pro-gay. All of those were lies, but were used by sectors of the Catholic Church. But other sectors of the Catholic Church, the more radical sectors, have supported his government. What I think is the problem for Correa is that Correa feels very uncomfortable with autonomous grassroots proposals, and he wants to centralize and to do things from the top down. The consequences of populism, I mean, it's a difficult question, and I should know the answer, but if you look at the history of Ecuador, the history of Velasquismo, you have the typical history of a populist government, a coup d'etat, and then another populist government coming through. And that was the case with the other populist governments since the transition to democracy. With Correa, because they are technocrats and they have social scientists in the government, social scientists should always stay teaching in a university. We can do very little damage there. I mean, we can brainwash students, and that can be dangerous, but we should stay there. But the consequences perhaps now will be to have a stronger executive and a government that will not fall into the traps of previous governments, as Cathy very eloquently described. I think that the main challenge and the main problem that Correa might have is that it's the economic crisis and the potential for dollarization to fall down, to evaporate, and to create a new national currency, and then people will go to the streets, and the military perhaps will have excuse to give a semi-constitutional coup d'etat. But
okay. Steve, do you want to jump in? Kathy?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues here. You know, I wouldn't characterize Correa's conduct as, I think your words were excessively strange. And when I hear the excessively, what I say, sort of compared to what? Or, what, I mean, I think in many ways he's, as Carlos described, I mean, there is a logic and there is a kind of consistency. I don't find it inconsistent his taking on of Brazil and the Brazilian investment, the arguments over the Brazilian contracts. I mean, I think he's, it's very consistent with his this virulent nationalist position, and so I think when he does that, he demonstrates that I'll throw I'm going to make the U.S. leave the Manta Air Base. I'll do that, but I'm willing to take on Lula at the same time if I think that's a demonstration. It helps me demonstrate that I'm protecting sovereignty. I mean, I think this. This sort of discourse on sovereignty is central to understanding Correa's mentality. I'm not sure he has, a completely full-blown project in his head of what he wants to do, but I think there's certain sensibilities that he has that keep getting expressed, and also these sensibilities, as Carlos indicated, are popular, have been popular for him. So those excessively strange would not be a word, would be words that I would choose. I think there really has been a lot of logic to what maybe on the surface are seemingly kind of contradictory positions. On the Consejo de Participación, Marguerite, I think there's not, if you, one of the duties of this Consejo de Participación is, for, along with all these other anti-corruption jobs they have to do, is to, they're supposed to establish participation, promote it, form citizens with valores. I mean, you can read all the stuff they're supposed to do in the Constitution. So they're charged with doing that as well. And I think one of the problems in this office is, the breadth of duties that they've been charged with. I think, it becomes hard to do all these things that they've been charged with. So far, the Consejo, from what I can tell, it's been traveling basically on a kind of listening tour in Ecuador. They've been traveling around doing seminarios in various locales, trying to figure out, I think, what their concrete project should be. I don't think it's evident at all, even to them, what it is. So it's very much still up in the air.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I'd add, I think there's an unpredictability to it. I mean, I sort of see that in terms of Correa, but I mean, I think to agree. I mean, I guess in some ways that there is certainly a logic there in a sense of these are popular nationalist acts, and there's sort of, I think, the political campaign aspect to it. I mean, I think there's also, perhaps there's nothing more genuine there than that, but it also may be, they're all acts, I think, on some level that can be seen, at least to a certain extent, as trying to figure out how a country like Ecuador carves out some sort of economic independence. And whether or not we agree with that, I think, or whether those acts sort of lead to that, I think is a good question. But at least I think that it's both popular, but then there's also sort of another aspect kind of there, perhaps. It's hard to say. I don't know.
Another round of questions. I see Sandy, Steve, and these two hands here, Ralph and someone along that wall. Yes. Okay. Please wait for the microphone. Sandy, you go first, then Steve. Okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Sandy Davis. I worked for many years in the World Bank until I retired in 2004. And one thing that I remember at that time, I worked on indigenous people's rights in Latin America. We once had the first indigenous member of an organization that ever came to Washington to the World Bank was from Ecuador. And also the first project that we ever did in the World Bank in the early 90s, in the late 80s and into the 90s, that provided support for indigenous peoples was in Ecuador. And the question I have is this. Ecuador, along with Bolivia and other Andean countries, approved the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in New York in September 2007, although the U.S. voted against it and Canada voted against it. The question I have, though, is this. Will the Korea government be supporting the OAS draft American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that will be considered this year? Will it be considered by the Korea government this year? One of the reasons I asked that, too, was at the 5th Summit of the Americas in the Caribbean in April, in their declaration, in their Article 86, they said that the country should support the OAS draft declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. So the question I have is, do we know if Ecuador will be one of the great supporters of that or not?
Steve, over here. Nikki. Well, while we're passing the microphone, I'd like to introduce Nikki Nichols from the Latin American program. At one point, Adam Stubbits was also in the room. There he is. Thank you. I'd like to thank both of them for their assistance with organizing this seminar. Also acknowledge that Carlos's family is here. His wife Carmen, his father-in-law, his 2 kids, somewhere in the room. So
they are in my office.
Okay. Well, they've heard it before. All right. Well, we welcome them as well. Steve, please.
Thanks, Cindy, for organizing a great panel. And Mike, it's sort of a question and sort of a frustration asking you to answer or to comment some more, Carlos. I'm Stephen Donahue from McClarty Associates. Since you're the Ecuadorian on the panel, how willing are Ecuadorians to live in for an extended period of time in this condition, which seems to be evolving towards a democratically elected autocracy, where the central government and the president seems to have more and more control and less accountability, where you see the impact on the press that Kathy talked about, the whole Consejo de Participación, which clearly was set up in large by and is formed by members that are supportive of the president, that are supposed to be selecting these independent entities that would normally be the watchdogs and the accountability centers for any government, and where you see even the superintendents, the banking superintendent and so forth, no longer an independent entity, which gets to the issue you talked about, Carlos, about whether or not the dollar can stand over time. How long does it matter to Ecuadorians? I mean, do they really want to have an accountable government, or do they just want a government that they feel good about and does what they think they like having done?
Okay, and then we had Ralph on this side and the woman that's a couple doors down.
I'm Ralph Esbeck with CNA.
Center for Naval Analysis, for those who are less
Right. One of the key political and economic powers in Ecuador, at least in recent years, has been the armed forces, and Correa has had a few instances of run-in with his armed forces, but in general, especially with their economic influence and their economic weight in the country, he hasn't moved. To my appearance, it seems to me he hasn't moved aggressively to kind of rein that in or to address some of the problems that come out of that relationship. I was wondering if you could comment a bit about the Ministry of Defense, his relationship with the armed forces, and where that might go, especially considering the context of concentrating power in the times of economic crisis, where his governance might become more and more of an issue.
And just done. Yeah, please.
Zakia Carr-Johnson from the Inter-American Foundation, representative for Ecuador and Venezuela. I have a quick question about the role of juntas parroquiales in developing citizenship or creating some sort of platform for citizen participation at a more grassroots level, and whether there still is a role for juntas parroquiales in the development, or I wouldn't say control of policy, or looking closely at government policy, but maybe more so in how citizens will participate in the future in terms of getting what they want out of their leaders at the local level as well as at the national level.
Another great set of questions. Steve, why don't we start with you? and we'll go to Kathy and end with Carlos.
Okay, I'm trying to think. I mean, I guess, yeah, I'm not sure, since I'm not an Ecuadorian, although that one question was quite interesting in terms of, democratically elected autocracy, in terms of more control and less accountability. I mean, I'm not sure, I guess I'm not sure. Part of what I see this, happening sort of both in Ecuador and other places is figuring out that question of accountability. Is what does that mean in Latin America in terms of and experimenting in some ways with democracy. I mean, I'm not sure. I guess it would, to me, it's sort of how do you create accountable governments outside of the context of elections? And it seems as though that's one of the things that populism at least is always dealing with. And I mean, I think it's a question sort of for our own country. I'm just sort of thinking about the last 8 or so years is sort of how do you make governments accountable outside of the context of elections? And that, maybe that's just throwing the question back, but I'm not sure exactly even how folks do that. But
you wouldn't have the president shouting down the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and threatening to close them down, as we had yesterday with Quito and Ecuador.
Yeah, well, I think you might have had our vice president doing some of those things in the last 8 years. Maybe not threatening to shut them down, but I guess it's not. The question isn't about the United States, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure if that means it's less accountable. But
Kathy,
Do you want to, this thing about how Ecuadorian, but did you want to follow up? Because he asked you specifically as a Ecuadorian.
Well, I think that it depends on what you mean by democracy. Correa will tell you, and he has said that in several places, that democracy means equity. Correa never militated in a left-wing party. In that sense, he's an oddity for that generation. And like many of us, he was never a militant of any crazy, small, radical party. But he holds the left distinction between formal democracy, which is bourgeois democracy, where all of the liberties are just a facade for the rule of the bourgeoisie, and real democracy. And for him, he went to Cuba to celebrate 50 years of the revolution and said, Cuba is a place where real democracy exists and where you have human rights. Okay, Correa said that, I don't, But that's one understanding of democracy. There are other people in his government who believe in projects of radical democracy, citizens' participations, giving the sovereignty back to the people. But they hate institutions, or they hated the previous institutions. Perhaps they will abide to the new institutions that they have created. But my question is, how can you have radical participatory democracy without strong liberal institutions and political parties? But Correa seems to have changed, because now he sees the necessity to create a party. So far he has been happy running as Fujimori with alliances with different caciques and anybody who wanted to be with him, but they will have to create some institutions. And then the last concept of democracy, liberal democracy, where you have pluralism, respect for liberties, separation of powers. Not too many Ecuadorians believe or practice that, even the ones who have written for that. When they have been in power, they have not really respected the rules of the game. I mean, who can be more democratic in their writings as Rodrigo Borja or Osvaldo Hurtado? Yet they were conspiring to get rid of Bucaram illegally, and many of their actions were not respecting the rules of the democratic game. So, unfortunately, I will say that most Ecuadorians do not respect liberal democracy. And why? The reason is because we never had a real bureaucratic authoritarian government. The Chilean left, the Argentinian left, the Brazilian left learned to value formal democracy because of the abuses of human rights in what they saw in the Soviet Union. So thank God, Ecuador never has gone to one of those radical repressive governments. So the left and other people do not respect liberal democracy. Let me address very fast some of the other questions. In terms of the armed forces, I don't know. The armed forces are the most unpredictable institution in Ecuador. When Gutierrez was in power, we at Flaxo had a colleague, General Jarrin, who was kicked out by Gutierrez, and he was a well-known general, and he was the chief of staff and all of that. And he was saying that Gutierrez was never going to be kicked out of power because all of his friends are in the top positions of the armed forces. And Gutierrez was kicked out of power with the excuse that the police could not deal with public order with very little demonstrations. I mean, demonstrations were fun, we were having a good time, but, you know, it was not something major. So you never know, but it's interesting that he has, as the Minister of Defense, a poet, Javier Ponce, a poet who has been written for several years against the armed forces, and I agree with Ponce. And so I think that the institution of the armed forces is very angry at Correa, but on the other hand, Correa has given them weapons. Because the idea is sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty. They have to control the national territory, they have to control the border with Colombia, but at the same time, what Ponce has been doing is try to bring more civilian supervision to the armed forces, but they have not touched on many of their economic privileges, and I don't know what will they do with that. That's something that I don't know. In terms of juntas parroquiales, I think that they are going to have a new election. I don't know exactly when. When is the new election for juntas parroquiales? It's for juntas parroquiales and also for Parlamento Andino. Juntas parroquiales were a very interesting case of democratization from below, and it's where the Pachacutic Indigenous Party had a big presence. What Correa has been doing with Pachacutic is to try to get away middle-level cadre and people who were part of Pachacutic, and they have been going to Alianza País. Now, Pachacutic still controls some provincial governments, and perhaps they will continue to control some juntas parroquiales. And in terms of indigenous rights, Ecuador, the Ecuadorian constitution recognized that Ecuador is a plurinational state. I mean, the same conquest, if you want to use that word, of the previous constitution are still there in place, and I don't know what the government will do in terms of signing or not this chart. Probably they will sign.
Okay. Kelly, do you have anything else to?
No, yeah, I mean, I haven't heard any official pronouncement on that OAS declaration, but I don't see why there would be any reason not to sign it. I mean, I think in terms of indigenous rights, what I think what everybody's waiting to see now as we enter into what might be a normal politics phase is I mean, I think, you know, you can sign all these declarations, but I think we know sort of the rubber's going to meet the road when Correa confronts, you know, various communities in relation to struggles over mining investment. I mean, that's going to be that's where we'll see, you know, to what extent, you know, there's a commitment to rights and due process and all those things. I mean, I think that's where we'll actually see how meaningful a commitment to indigenous rights is going to be.
Sure. This gentleman right here.
Thank you. I'm Douglas Southgate from Ohio State University, and first of all, in looking at your book, I was thinking about a warning that I received very early in my career from an older colleague. I was working on an edited volume, and he said, "Why don't you just write it yourself? It's so much easier." And later on, I found out that was true. So I salute you for undertaking this task. And like Kathy Conahan, I appreciated the recipes. I liked a lot of the historical chapters, including first-hand observations by figures such as Galo Plaza Lasso. But I must say, I guess this, maybe I'm struck by trends in some of the other social sciences. Again, I'm an economist, but I'm struck by what's not in what I would have expected to see in a comprehensive Ecuador reader, if I can cite your title. When, for example, there seems to be very, very little what I would recognize as empirical content. And I realize I might have a different view of that, but for example, there's barely a mention, and much less is there any analysis of the profound demographic changes that Ecuador has experienced in recent years. For example, the plunging infant mortality rates, the fact that the life expectancy at birth has gone over 70 years, if I'm correct in that. The total fertility rate, I can see in my wife is from Ecuador, and she's one of 8, and I think she has one sister who had 4 children. Everybody else had 2 or 3. So the total fertility rate has gone toward the replacement level. Why wasn't there a chapter about these profound demographic changes, which, by the way, are representative of what's happened in many other parts of the developing world? And then I also have to say, pardon me for sticking up for my field, but I just question why there wasn't a chapter on Ecuador's economic development. And this omission, to me, is particularly glaring because various chapter authors pepper their contributions with vague references to neoliberalism, globalization, and so forth. All these references strike me as vague. Certainly, there's a lot of antipathy shown for all these processes, but I don't see, for example, from one chapter, globalization from above versus globalization from below. I don't see that defined. Instead, I see assertions and what look to me like cherry-picked interviews with this or that victim or whatever. And frankly, this doesn't strike me as social science, but I'm willing to concede that I'm as old-fashioned as my hairline.
Okay. Sure. This gentleman right here.
I'm John Sambrelo from the Pan American Development Foundation. Worked with Ecuador for the past 40 years. I'd like to raise a similar question as the previous speaker, and also address the issue of instability. For many of us who've worked with Ecuador, you've had these sporadic periods of economic growth and then these periods of instability. And I've always been impressed by what I've called the gridlock society. You've had this intense social and political mobilization that you've talked about. You've had Conaya, Pachacuti that are unprecedented in the Andean countries. You have widespread participation of indigenous people, even though the indigenous people are a very small minority, less than 10% of the overall population, which is not fully appreciated. That this is largely a mestizo society. Most of the majority of the Ecuadorians live on the coast, not in the Sierra, not in the Oriente. Yet you have these highly mobilized society that has made it very difficult for governments, certainly since the democratic transition. I, too, have followed the democratic transition. I was a USAID director during that period of time. You haven't, I think, really addressed the issues of economic growth and the underlying inability of this society to grow except during the 1950s with the banana boom, with the 1970s with the petroleum boom, and then these spurts peter out, and the inability of the society to adopt these fundamental economic reforms. And the Correa government seems to have continued this fundamental hostility towards those types, neoliberals, the attacks against the neoliberal failures, the demonization of the neoliberal reforms. And many of us who've worked with Ecuador feel that the problem has really been lack of implementation of the neoliberal model. And your book, I think, takes a different tact, and many of the authors seem to assume the demonization of what is talked about as neoliberal. And I think the book, there is a body of academic work out there that does exist and could have been included, that presented the failures of economic policy, longstanding, that are continuing under the Correa administration. And I really think that does need to be addressed. I think in a number of the cases, I would have argued that you could have included some other authors to balance some of the other authors. I think there tends to be a one-sided presentation. I think the presentation on bananas in particular by Professor Striffler is one-sided. I think Ecuador would not today be the world's leading exporter of bananas without the investment and transfer of technology by the United Fruit Company and Standard Fruit Company. And I think you have a very illustrative Ecuadorian who wrote one of the definitive studies on the United Fruit Company, and that's Galo Plaza. And I was sort of disappointed that there wasn't an excerpt from Galo Plaza's The United Fruit Company in Latin America that takes a very different view than Professor Striffler does in his book. And this, I think, is just one example where what comes across is the demonization of multinationals, of foreign investors, of what is pejoratively referred to as neoliberal thinking and neoliberal model, without any real explanation or presentation of this. And I think this book has many strengths, and I found much value in there, particularly in the pre-Columbian part of this. But I think there are some real gaps here that don't lead to the broadest understanding of Ecuador. And I think with the limited information about Ecuador that exists, particularly in the United States, has been talked about, I think the book certainly does demonstrate the diversity of Ecuador, but I think it could have perhaps presented greater diversity in some of the authors. Thank you.
Right of reply.
You know, this happens when you have an anthropologist and a sociologist who's not quantitative editing a book on Ecuador, and I really appreciate this discussion and these critiques. But what can I tell you? I think that what we wanted to present in the book was a panoramic view of different trends in Ecuadorian society. And and of course our bias was there, and it's there from the beginning. We come from a certain leftist political economy type of perspective, and that's, you know, I'm not saying that that's the only way in which you can analyze a society. It has a series of problems, and I appreciate what you have said. In terms of Galo Plaza, we included Galo Plaza, but talking about education for indigenous people, we felt that was much more interesting, because, see, Plaza is somebody who was a forerunner in educating indigenous people in a very racist context in which many people were telling Plaza, you know, perhaps your Indians are more intelligent than ours. These Guatemalans were saying that, so that's why we wanted to rescue out of Plaza. But of course there are a series of gaps, and I hope that this can create a discussion, a conversation that can help all of us to study Ecuador more deeply.
Yeah, no, I guess I agree. I mean, I think it probably is both kind of a disciplinary difference and then sort of a political difference in our perspectives, which, I mean, I appreciate those comments as well, and I think they're well taken. I think also, I could be wrong, but one of the things that sort of happened, I think, along the way when we were doing it, and I won't speak for Carlos on this, but I think, and I sort of mentioned this in the beginning, I saw it more as an edited book where we would include essentially academic contributions, and I think, in fact, there was a piece on the economic development of Ecuador. As we went along, we realized that this wasn't the model for the readers, a model that we were given to by the press, which includes having, recipes, which I don't think... Well, we like food and we like to eat and all that, but I don't think that was our natural inclination to have those. So certain things we ended up pulling that were more academic and less probably that a general audience was thought to enjoy less. And I think that would probably include... that was what I was going to say. It would probably include the articles on economics and demographics, and those kinds of things got pulled for that. I actually, I think, and then the political question, which is interesting. I mean, maybe Carlos disagrees, but I actually think we held ourselves back remarkably well. In terms of, when I look in here, I don't find actually that many pieces that are particularly critical of neoliberalism. I mean, in defense of my own piece on the banana industry, I mean, I think actually within the context of historians, at least working on the United Fruit Company, my piece is certainly within the mainstream, I think, of thinking on that, much more so than sort of the body of work that I think more so than Gallo Plaza would have been. Although I think as a historical artifact, I think his reading and his interpretation is really interesting. But I don't know, I felt like that we we were conscious of that, but perhaps maybe not enough. And I wouldn't be surprised if other folks would come at us from the other direction in terms of the inclusions in here. But point well taken.
I have one last question that I can't resist asking, because a number of you, there were some questions about the armed forces and also about the use of the sovereignty argument by Correa, and I think Catherine was the one who said that the biggest scandal of the country had really nothing to do with corruption, but rather with, the Colombian incursion that killed a senior FARC commander. I was wondering if you could comment on the sort of use and abuse of that of the issue of the presence of the FARC within Ecuadorian territory, and why, if the sovereignty argument was being used to mobilize not only national but international sentiment against Colombia for a cross-border attack, why sovereignty didn't similarly play in terms of the guerrillas being established within Ecuadorian territory and having it fairly well known, that if you wanted to see this or that person within the FARC, you went to Ecuador to try to find him. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, the issue has certainly the issue has become kind of part of Correa's attack against the press. I mean, that's one way in which it's been used. So he's been, when there's been aggressive reporting and trying to dig into what's happened, or trying to establish, because I'm not sure we even have an accepted view of what's happened. I mean, there's investigative processes going right now vis-a-vis Gustavo Lorrea. I don't think the definitive report has been put out about that yet. Mm-hmm. So we don't really have any kind of, there's no consensus, national consensus on exactly what happened. But I think when reporters who have been following that story have been accused of being anti-patriotic for their reporting on the story, so it's been part of this. It has been one of the ways it's been kind of used or misused is in mounting an attack on the press when they investigate this theme too much.
It got sent to the Congresillo, sent it to Archivo, so it's not going to be.
Oh, okay.
Officially. Yeah.
Okay, I haven't seen the news for 2 days.
But see, the uses of on the one hand, it's important to understand that Correa's logo, and Kathy analyzes very nicely in some of her pieces, was the homeland is coming back. And the idea is that Ecuador has surrendered everything, even our national currency. So Correa, we lost the sucre to the dollar, and people were crying for that. Others were not that sad. But anyways, the idea is that we have lost our sovereignty, that we have lost our nation. And the nation is coming back, and Correa embodies the nation. So the idea of sovereignty, of respecting Ecuadorian borders, of bringing some sense of order in the state, coming back to protect citizens, the national frontier, and all of that is very important, and that's what they have been. That's part of what they have been doing, and this goes together with the idea that they are doing a revolution. After all, it's a citizens' revolution, and there are some people there who have not fully understand that the FARC lost its revolutionary appeal a long time ago, and there are some people there that they still see the FARC as a nice guerrilleros fighting against this horrible emblema of neoliberalism, who is Uribe. So, I mean, there is and in a way, yeah, because the left that is with, I mean, when Correa started his campaign, was very interesting to see in his rallies, is that the hardcore of supporters, they were young people, which was great to see young people getting involved in politics, and they were leftists, which was also something nice for me, but what was for me about troubling is that the way in which they were leftists was by being Bolivarians. So they were Chavistas, and they were sympathizers of FARC in a way. I mean, that's his supporters. So there is this sense that FARC is not as bad as other people will see it, and but especially this idea of sovereignty.
Right, and I would just say, I talked about it as a scandal, and it is a scandal in the traditional sense of being, something revealed by the press and creating a lot of. But I think in terms of sort of the state of Ecuadorian public opinion about it, I think I have to. I mean, I was there in February and March, and while it's a scandal, perhaps more for the politically attentive public or politically attentive elites more than it is for, in a sense, the mass public. You don't get a sense that people, especially that it's not a highly salient issue for many people, as typically foreign policy things aren't highly salient. I can't say it's something that people talk about all that much as an important. So I think it sort of for the mass public, it hasn't seemed that important. And I think there's a sense that, right, so it's more a scandal for elites than for the mass public. That's my sensation about it.
Mm-hmm. That's usually the case. Okay. Well, we'll take perhaps one more quick question. I don't want things to kind of, dribble down. There was a hand. Go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Kelly McBride, and I was the representative of the Carter Center in Ecuador and Colombia for a year and a half. And we were running a dialogue project between opinion makers from Ecuador and Colombia, and also a shuttle diplomacy project between the two presidents trying to reestablish relations. And I wanted to make a couple comments on this FARC comment and the Colombia-Ecuador relationship, which has been very rough since the year 2000 when fumigation started. But first of all, guerrillas from Colombia have been going into Ecuador for years and years and years, using it as a place of relaxation. So, for example, Antonio Navarro Wolf, who's the head of the M19, people used to go there and get married. They go there on their honeymoon. They go there to get boots. So there's a long history of that being a very porous border. On the Colombian side, a lack of state presence, and on the Ecuadorian side, a little bit more. And what's recently happened with this FARC situation, aside from the scandal, is that Ecuadorians all of a sudden realize, I think, that having illegal armed actors on the border who are starting to move over with everything that means is very dangerous for their own security. And so you have some paramilitaries from Colombia who've come over recently who are up in the Caribbean side. You have precursor chemicals going in. You have the transportation of drugs. You have women who are sort of forced into a situation of prostitution. And you have a lot of spillover of all the illicit activities and armed actors for Ecuador. And this has been a wake-up call for Ecuador, I would say. And I think that's been really kind of the biggest impact. I mean, people are used to living it for a while, but now it's getting worrisome for Ecuadorians, and I also think for the government, without addressing really what the connections are there. But if there's a connection, I won't say it's the first government in Ecuador who may have had some type of deal with the FARC.
Please join me in thanking Catherine, Steve, for traveling from Canada and New Orleans, respectively, and Carlos for being with us this entire year. We hope you will purchase their book and make your own judgment and certainly learn a lot more about Ecuador than many of us knew coming into the room. Thank you very much for joining us.